Jose, will we see the participants as they're coming in?
So we can see that there are 11 people logged in so far.
Yeah, but they haven't come up onto our screen though, have they?
I think that they would probably be with us now.
Okay, great. Awesome. So we'll give it a couple more minutes. Welcome those who are arriving into this space. And we will be starting our discussion very, very soon.
I think a few more minutes for a few extra people coming through. I think that there's a couple extras making their ways into the Zoom right now.
It's always the start when we're waiting for everyone to come in, that awkward silence of when we actually take off.
It'd be nice if we were able to see everybody that was
It would be very nice.
you know. I
Yeah.
think we're probably at the number.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone for choosing to join this space. And my name is Kimberley Garlick, and I am the president of PAA. And I'm joined here today by Jose Horn, who is the actual national licensing manager for OneMusic and has over 10 years experience within the fitness and wellness industry, having and opening these discussions. I was really looking forward to being able to have this discussion with you today, Jose, for our industry, because having this really good, open, and collaborative discussion together helps us navigate what we're maybe not really aware of or aren't up to date with. And so, thank you very much for choosing to join us. And I hope everybody gets a lot of information and can answer their own questions. So let's get it started, Jose, and you
So
can
much,
take the
Kimberly,
floor.
and welcome everyone that's made it to the presentation today. Um, Hopefully, you all come away with something. And if you have sat through one of these before, hopefully it's a refresher and it's not something that's too simple and boring for you. But before I do kick off, I guess the thing to keep in mind is that we're very aware that there is tons and tons of information out there when it comes to music licensing and just generally this type of regulatory requirement for businesses. There are lots of different ways that things can be approached, and there's lots of options and just different ways that people can navigate it. So I'm hoping that with the presentation today, we'll be able to touch on some good overall bits of info that will hopefully provide you all with a good understanding of why we operate, why licensing for music actually exists. Hopefully, you know how you can approach us and obtain a license for your
Mm.
business if you need one. But I think what I will just start with is just a little disclaimer. It may be a little light on in some parts, but because of that, we encourage you all after this presentation, or whenever it may be that you've watched this presentation, to reach out to us and speak to us. We've got a bunch of different ways that you can get in touch. And initially, we just have a conversation with you to gauge where things are at and give you a few hypothetical sort of options. So
Mm.
it's totally obligation free for people in terms of just reaching out, getting information, and drilling down in a little bit more detail as to what your business needs may be. So
Mm.
with that in mind, I'll kick off the presentation, and just so everybody knows, I've got just a standard presentation for you all. Through the presentation, Kimberley and I may have a little bit of a conversation depending on what comes up. But afterwards, we'll touch on a few other bits of info in a little bit more detail.
Mm.
And we'll have a little bit of a conversation that maybe provides some more key bits of info for you all that you can take with. So I'll just get my screen shared for you all.
And whilst you're doing that, Jose, I might just put out there as well, what we're going to do is put this into a little document for our PAA members. And also there will be a recording available as well. So if you need to retouch on anything, we will have both a recording as well as a written sort of summary of it all.
Perfect. So just to check, are you seeing my screen right now?
Perfect. Yes.
Yep. Is it just me, or are you seeing my presentation, music licensing, and Pilates?
We're seeing the presentation and you perfectly.
Perfect. Fantastic. Before I carry on, I also just want to mention that behind the scenes is my colleague, Carolyn Lee, who has also been with OneMusic for a really, really long time. And she is actually somebody who specializes in dealing specifically with Pilates businesses, both on the fitness and the clinical side of things. So Carolyn is somebody I'm here putting on this presentation, but when it comes to actually dealing with someone at OneMusic, I just want to call out her name and for her to get for you to be familiar with her. She is super knowledgeable and super easy to deal with, and there she is saying hello. And we'll be able to assist you all should you get in touch after this.
Perfect.
So, kicking things off, my name's Jose Horn. As I said, as Kimberley stated, I've been with OneMusic for quite a while, and about 10 years now working in fitness and wellness. It's a great industry, and I think one of the challenges is that it's also one of the industries that is a little bit complicated in terms of the way that licensing may be applied. And one of the reasons for that really is that there are just so many different types of businesses that operate within the different umbrellas of whether it's fitness or wellness or ancillary kind of clinical services. It's really a beast of an industry if you consider all of those different parts of it. So it's a little harder to have really simple, concise licenses where one size fits all. So for that reason, we've got a specialist team. Not all industries have a specialist team when it comes to OneMusic licensing, but certainly this is one of those ones where the people you'll deal with know pretty well how your industries operate. So in the presentation today, the three key parts that we will cover, obviously, what is OneMusic? So getting you all as much info on that as possible. The types of music that are available or that are out there for you to use, and how licensing may potentially apply when you use those different types of music in your business, and more specifically how licensing applies in the Pilates space. So a lot of the information in points 1 and 2, they can really be applied to any industry. So for those that don't know, OneMusic deals with hospitality, we deal with government, we deal with dance schools, we deal with educational sector. It's really an all-encompassing thing. So really points 1 and 2 will be pretty straightforward across any industry. So if you do have another business or you know people that are in other businesses, feel free to take that information with you. We'll also touch on where the money goes, because I know that's something that does interest people. But importantly, I've put that disclaimer there. No pricing is quoted in this presentation, and it's not because we don't want you to know the pricing. All of our pricing is public. It's all on our website. We will be talking to you about it in detail if you make contact with us. But it's just lots of numbers, and there's lots of different ways that this can be sliced and diced. So it's probably not something that we'll put in the presentation, but that we can discuss in more detail, for example, with Kimberley or with any of you individually down the line. So getting stuck in, what is OneMusic? So in the Australian music landscape, there have long been two organisations that represent the world of music. So on the one hand, you have the PBCA, which is the Phonographic Performance Company of Australia. And the PBCA is an organisation that represents record labels. So really, it's more about products. So when traditionally back in the day, you might have purchased a CD. Say today, when you access music on a streaming service, a lot of those end products, so the recorded packaged music that ends up on those products is represented by the PPCA. So they are more concerned about the end point. But obviously, for a song or a piece of music to get to that end point, it has to go through an entire process of being written and refined and then potentially played live first. And only then will it end up on a recording. So at the beginning of things, you've got APRA AMCOS, who represent songwriters and music publishers. So to give you a little bit of a basic rundown, the two organisations in Australia that operate are PPCA for record labels and recording artists, and APRA AMCOS, who represents songwriters and music publishers. So these two things have worked in unison together for many years. For around 60 odd years, these two organisations have been two pieces of, or two cogs, I guess, in the machine that is the music industry in Australia. And this is a normal thing in a lot of countries around the world, because the recording industry and the songwriting industry, believe it or not, they're a little bit different. They're not really the same thing. They work together, but songwriters aren't necessarily performers and performers aren't necessarily songwriters. So they've got different representation. So one of the challenges that this put to people is that for many years, there were licensing considerations across both of these organisations. So a few years back, the PPCA and APRA came together to actually create a single licensing organisation for music called OneMusic. And hence, OneMusic is PPCA and APRA's baby. And through having that single license, we're able to package up all of the rights that may be contained within both a piece of music as far as its writing and the ownership there, but also the end recording. So the recording artist, the label, the product that gets put to you at the end point, whether that's through a piece of music or a music video or whatever it may be. So all of that can now be encompassed into a single point, which is the OneMusic license.
So, Jose, in the past, would have people had to therefore have the rights with both PPCA plus the APRA and AMCOS? So was there two different costs in the past?
Right.
And now
Yeah. For a lot of industries, there were. For some, not so much. But for example, if we take sort of one of the more obvious ones being, say, fitness or hospitality, where music is very important to the operation of those businesses, then by all means the PPCA were a very active licensing organisation. It was something that, as you can imagine, created a lot of confusion and a little bit of, I guess, anxiety in the marketplace, because people would not really quite understand, hang on a second, I already paid a license for music. Why do I need another one? So I guess the reason that people often associate licensing with APRA predominantly is because, being the organisation that represents songwriters, the APRA license is a constant. It doesn't matter what products you use, whether you're using radio or certain CDs or certain streaming services, there's always going to be a songwriter. So the APRA license was always a foundational license, whereas the PPCA license was a little bit more specific for certain scenarios and certain uses of music. It was in 2019, well, it was much earlier than that, but in 2019, the two organisations finally launched the first OneMusic licenses that combined all of the rights. So yeah, some of the people in maybe even in this call, but certainly people that I know that have been in the industry for a long time would remember the times that the PPCA and APRA operated individually. Yeah.
Yep.
So moving on to, why might someone need a music license? So that's really why we're here. And the answer, I guess, is a little bit boring. But, the use of protected music in Australia requires permission. Um, in Australia, that permission is granted to you in the form of a OneMusic license.
Mm-hmm.
So hypothetically, the permission could be obtained from other parties, but because, as I explained, OneMusic represents the interests of major record labels, of practically all songwriters, and I'll explain a little later how encompassing that is in terms of a global reach. It really is something that it's been deemed to be better managed by a single organization because there are so many millions of songs and millions of songwriters that make up this system. Hypothetically, you could obtain permission directly from each of those songwriters or each of those artists, but we essentially aggregate that permission. So that's essentially what the licenses are about. The reason we exist, as we said, so APRA is actually OneMusic is managed by APRA. So we've brought in the PPCA rights, but in terms of our actual management, we are part of APRA still. And APRA stands for the Australasian Performing Rights Association. And APRA was actually founded all the way back in 1926 to issue licenses on behalf of songwriter members. So basically, back then, it all kicked off with songwriters becoming a little concerned at their music being used in certain ways. And one of the big uses of music back then is in radio. So by 1926, the radio industry was completely commercial, very similar to what we would expect or what we see today. There was already advertising and various other ways that music was used commercially. And songwriters sort of thought, hang on a second, if there's money being made off our music being played on the station, shouldn't we maybe have a say or have a cut of that money? And that's essentially what brought about the inception of APRA in 1926. So we've now turned 100 years this year. So for anyone who thought maybe this was something fairly recent or new, the surprise is that we're one of the oldest commercial organisations in Australia. And we've been operating non-stop since then. And yeah, absolutely have dealt with millions and millions of rights holders in that time.
So when you've got a rights holder or a license as you know, with APRA and now OneMusic, is that then under a government umbrella, or is that as a whole, like you're sitting as your own entity, or how does the sort of regulation of that stand within Australia?
It's a great question. So ultimately, we are not a government organisation because we represent the interests of private individuals mostly. So really, that's not something the government can kind of directly become involved in. But the government obviously identifies the benefit of an organisation like ours in terms of representing the interests of so many people. So what happens is we are endorsed formally by the Attorney General's office. So from a legal standpoint, the Attorney General's office, but then there's also a federal court wing that is kind of, I guess, in place to manage some of this stuff. So it's called the Copyright Tribunal, which is part of the federal court. So that's where the federal stuff comes in. We are also authorised to operate by the ACCC. So that's an additional layer of kind of federal government endorsement. Yeah. So whilst we're not completely a government organisation, we absolutely are endorsed and backed, I guess, by the government in terms of how we operate and what we do. And it's a perfect segue to our next slide, which is that all of this can occur courtesy of the Copyright Act, which, although APRA was set up in 1926, it wasn't until 1968 that Australia formally identified and ratified its copyright legislation. And that's really the link between our organisation and the government, because they're the ones that ultimately manage and put forward these rules and laws, and we're the ones that enforce them. So one of the things that I love to bring up when I talk about the Copyright Act, and although we're talking about music here today, it's something that's really important to bring up because music is not the only thing that's protected by the Copyright Act. The Copyright Act is also protects written word. It also protects visual art, moving image, patents, trademarks, all of this stuff essentially that encompasses the world of intellectual property. So music is one part of that, and APA and OneMusic are very prominent in that. But there are also organisations and protections that handle all sorts of other things elsewhere as well.
Seem like a little bit of a simplified sort of version of this is basically you're regulated. So therefore, where like Pilates is a non-regulated body at the moment, but PAA, for example, well, not just PAA, many people are trying to create it as a regulated format, and that helps people understand then sort of where things sit and why there are these more stringent rules around it. So the artists came together and it became a regulated industry. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the things behind obviously an organization like yours would have different reasons to regulate certain things. But for us, one of the main reasons is obviously transparency. So being able to have published price points, being able to deal with everyone in a similar manner, being able to also represent our members in the same way. So one of the biggest misconceptions is that if you're more famous, you're treated better by organizations like us. And that's simply untrue. You may make more money because you're more successful, perhaps, or because your music is used more. But one of the key parts of the way that we operate is that every piece of music has the same value. So that's one of the things that songwriters understood early on. And it was really a way of unionizing their strength or their numbers to be able to match the power of commercial entities on the other side. So that has then morphed into what the association is today. So the question, I guess, that flows on from this is, how do I know that the music I'm listening to is actually copyright protected? Because ultimately that's where we are. That's where we sit. We represent copyright music. So this can really be identified by having a think about the different types of music that exist out in the marketplace today. So there are really three categories of music. There are full rights music, partial rights music, and then royalty-free and AI music. So I'll run through those for everybody to have a think about, how that may apply to your business and how you can maybe take advantage of this, whether it's by using music or not. So at the top of the tree, we've got full rights music, and that's really the stuff, it's commercial music. It's the most easily accessible. So you might already own a bunch of it. You might listen to it on the radio. You might listen to it on streaming services. And it's obviously the most recognizable. It's what people know and love. And all of this type of music will absolutely require a license, and it will be a full fee license. It's got full rights. And that going back to the PPCA and APRA thing, it's just the all-encompassing license. This is far and away the most common type of license we issue because people just want to have the option and the choice to play whatever they want. So that'll be where they land. Moving down a touch, we've got partial rights. So particularly in fitness, it's quite popular to use partial rights music. So partial rights music is basically covers, and covers have a really interesting function because even though they still have the same songwriter and there's still a piece of music that's protected, by using covers, there's a bypassing of the record labels, of the major record labels. So there's a whole sound recording element of the license that can be bypassed. And for that reason, it's a lower fee. There's a big reduction in the fee. It's practically halved the fee. So these are specialized music services. I know that Les Mills have a PPCA free option. One of the popular ones is Power Music, for example. They're like, they're in the business of re-recording pieces of music and then packaging them up for the use in classes specifically. And a curious one to think about is free-to-air radio or digital radio. That has an exemption in the Copyright Act that allows it to be partial rights. So it can be a good way to get quality music in your business without paying a full license. Moving on to, I guess, what is spoken about so much these days is really originally royalty-free music, but really with technology now that's kind of morphed into AI music. So for many years, royalty-free music was available. It was just kind of like made by companies outside of the system. And there's still a lot of that used in like film productions and things like that. But now that's obviously been largely replaced by AI music. So with AI music, it can certainly be handy for certain uses. Like I just mentioned, audiovisual productions is a really handy one because there are no rights involved with this. The limitations are that, at least so far, it's fairly limited content. So you might not be able to run a business 365 days a year playing royalty-free or AI music. And I guess depending on the business, it might be a downside that your customers don't recognize or know the music. The big uptick, though, the big upside for some people who are maybe cost conscious is that there's no licensing fee. There sometimes is a purchase fee associated with this, so there may be, or a subscription fee, but there's no additional level of fee that may kick in from an organisation like ours. And that's simply because it's not music that falls into our bucket. So for the music to fall into our bucket, it must be written and produced by people who have either joined our association directly or that we're affiliated with. And corporations that make AI music, obviously that's not in their remit. They don't join, they don't collect royalties. They simply sell this stuff for quick consumption. So it's something to consider. I know that this type of music does suit some businesses, and we're really open-minded about that. We understand that some businesses do quite well with it, but it can be limiting, and the customers often will have their say about this, and you know, it's not the best, I guess.
Yeah, and I think too, with the AI, from my very small experience with this, is that then they're actually using artists, like a little bit of the artist's music or
That's
the
right.
artist's words, but the artist isn't getting paid for it as well. I just know this from speaking to a few artists themselves in that
Absolutely.
regard
Yeah.
too. So just
Yeah, it's
it's
something that,
that
you know,
conundrum, isn't it? Of
it is a conundrum, and I think it's a classic example
mm,
that we've seen time and time again of technology moving a little faster than regulations.
mm,
Um, and, you know, for example, through APRA, we're currently one of the organisations that's lobbying quite hard at Canberra in terms of just trying to get some protections in place, because mining existing protected works, whether it's music or art or, you know, written word, it's something that really, if it weren't for the protected content that we represent, these AI models wouldn't exist. So there's a direct correlation between the music that is owned by, in many cases, Australian songwriters. There is a
mm.
direct link to the AI content that's being produced. So we've put our hand up to say, well, if there's a direct link, then surely there should be a direct compensation.
Yeah.
As it stands today, though, unfortunately, I can say it's free for you guys to use it and without a license. And it, like I said, it will have a cost associated to it. It's not necessarily cheap, but it just, some people just think it's worth it for the convenience of not dealing with a license. So that's kind of the reality we live in today. But we're hopeful that in due course there will be some, I guess, carving up of some of those fees that these companies collect that will hopefully come back to the artist who have provided the music that's allowed that to be to exist in the first place. Yeah. So I guess in summary, when it comes to the music, here are just a bunch of different logos. I mean, you probably recognize most of them, but if you ever come across any of these logos, you're going to need a license from OneMusic. Like it's a pretty common thing. I mean, some people assume that maybe dealing with companies that are professional, that have already, that, you know, that you have to pay quite a bit of money for, that it comes with a license built in, and that in the case of a lot of industries, that's not so. You still need your own license. there are some very small pockets of the world that allow you to have no license with some of these services. But again, we would discuss that with you directly, depending on the business that you operate.
Mm. Yeah.
Um,
This might be a
so
really nice segue for us to jump in and use a little bit of a scenario, do you think?
straight after I run through this, we
Yeah,
can
sure.
absolutely do it
Great.
because I'm just going to go through and talk about some of the specifics with the Pilates
Okay.
businesses.
Amazing. Great.
So I'll let you know. This is just a little segue. It's actually something just for people to have a think about. It's a little morsel of info, really. But does music matter? That's a question that Dr. Peter Terry from the University of Southern Queensland asked himself. So Peter Terry is a researcher and in psychology, and he asked this question and thought to himself, well, what's the situation? So Peter Terry found that music has psychological responses, obviously. It has physiological responses, and it also, therefore, has performance outcomes. So this is something that we speak to a lot of fitness and wellness businesses quite openly, because music can actually assist in the delivery of what you're trying to do and in the goals that you're trying to achieve with your clients and your participants. So in the case of Peter Terry's research, the actual research confirmed that music has the power to reduce perceived exhaustion by about 10%. So what that ultimately results in is the ability for people that are taking part in physical activity to go a little harder and to actually get a little more out of what they're doing if music is there and playing and assisting them with that. So it's just a little something, a little segue. I love to throw that in there because
That's great.
there are a few other bits of research that we've sort of found and conducted. And overwhelmingly, music is always a net benefit to businesses that use it. And there's also specific benefits to using well-known music, so things that people can actually identify. So that's definitely something to consider. So here we've arrived, Kimberley, at the section. What OneMusic licenses apply to Pilates? So I'll quickly run through it, and then we'll have a chat about how this can apply to your scenarios. Like I said, this is a part where it'll feel like we're skimming through it because there's just so much that we could cover. But if any of you are encouraged to speak to us about your specific business, these are the things that we'll talk about, and we'll get into more detail about your specific operations, just like Kimberley and I will do just after this. So basically, when we deal with a Pilates business, there's a bit of a checklist. So the checklist will be, does the business use background music? And background music is really that ongoing, non-stop, go in the morning, turn something on. It may service general areas where there may be treatment areas, or it may be reception areas. It may be a gym area, but it's just kind of there all the time. If the business does use background music, is the Pilates business fitness-based, or is it more of a clinical or medical scenario? So that will make a difference, and I'll run through why in a moment. I think that most people in the Pilates industry know which side of that fence they fall on, because it really is kind of like a subgenre. There's two schools there that operate together, but we can often see it. So I'm sure that, for people that are actually in there, you can certainly see it too. Not to say that there aren't some businesses that maybe are on the fence a little bit. We understand that. And finally, does the business use protected music during group Pilates sessions? And this is a key one as well, because this is probably the more costly component and something that people need to keep in mind. So working through it, the clinical stuff, we generally will issue what we call a retail and general license for background music in a clinical setting. So it's generally applied to businesses that are more, say, physio, chiro, medical, where Pilates is a component of that business, where it's a practice, where it's maybe more one-on-one type of practitioner type of work. And the way that we issue that license is based on the overall area in square meters that the music is audible. So we might consider your practice with a reception area and a couple of like treatment rooms, and that could be, for example, how the license is applied. It's a very, very, very straightforward license. On the other hand, if you are a fitness business, so if you're certainly delivering, whether it's mat Pilates, reformer Pilates, but it's done kind of in the classic fitness way, with a studio, without those other treatment type areas and without that kind of clinical component, then we will often categorize you as a background music license for fitness. And the difference between the two licenses is that the fitness license is actually based on total number of members or people using the facilities. So it's usually just a kind of a guesstimate, you could say, because I mean, people don't necessarily take note of every single individual. But for the most part, businesses like these will have membership models, and it's easy for them to be able to say, yeah, well, we've got 100 or 200 or 300 members, whatever it might be. So regardless of whether you use background music in a clinical or a fitness way, we will then query whether you use music in classes. So obviously the most common classes right now are your group reformer classes. You've also got group mat classes. And for us to issue a license for a class, all of these things must exist. So protected music is audible during class. The class is advertised on a timetable, so in advance. So it's not by appointment. It's rather like a publicly advertised thing. It's led by a physical instructor, so not a video instructor, but a physical instructor. And in those cases, we generally will look initially at licensing it on a per class rate. So in addition to the background music license that a business might have, we would add a class-based license. So that's the combination that generally exists. You'll either have a background music license, whether it's a fitness or a clinical one, and then you'll have the featured license, which is the big ticket item, music in classes, which will come in as well. I guess this is where it gets a little tricky because some businesses are definitely very obviously in the class space, some are not so much. So again, this is why we love to have a conversation with you directly and work it out. So something that people always ask, there's also an additional license that can apply, which is called digital delivery. And this is when you use some of these domestic, non-commercial streaming services in your business. So one of the questions that always comes up is, if I'm already paying Spotify, I'm already paying Apple Music, why do I need a license? And the reason is these companies don't actually authorize themselves to be able to sell this into a business. One of the reasons that they've been able to sell their services cheaply is because they don't actually have the necessary permissions for this to be used in a business. And that is stated in the terms of use when you sign up to them. It says, I'll only use this in a personal setting, in a domestic setting. So we have to top that up and make it kind of compliant. So in a lot of cases, businesses will have what we call a digital delivery license. In addition to this, if you're using a commercial service, for example, in some of the slides previously, I put up Soundtrack Your Brand or Les Mills or Nightlife. Like there are a bunch of suppliers out there that are commercial. Those ones do not require the digital delivery license, but the trade-off is that they're more expensive per month. So it kind of works itself out in the end. So we've gone through background music, music for classes, and digital delivery. Issuing all three of those licenses, however, is relatively uncommon because we will ultimately assess whether a Pilates studio is eligible for an all-inclusive license. And the all-inclusive license, again, it's based on total number of members, but it's usually a capped fee and it's great for class-based studios. So any of these studios that have, a heavy timetable, that have tons of reformer Pilates, for example, with music playing, 9 times out of 10, those businesses will be better off and really well served by one of our all-inclusive licenses. To give you an idea, if we added up all of these things we've talked about, in some cases, a business might be paying $5,000, $6,000, $7,000. The all-inclusive license is capped at about $4,000, so everybody pays that or less. In the case of the more clinical studios where the Pilates may be occurring on a one-on-one or two-on-one appointment basis, those things are not assessed as classes, so those studios are paying far less than that, usually in the hundreds. So that's kind of the spectrum of fees that we generally see. And whenever any business does use a lot of classes, like I said, we will generally always default to a capped all-inclusive license, which is just it's just a really, really convenient way to do it.
Mhm.
So obviously I've breezed through all of that, and I guess now Kimberley and I can have a little chat about some of the stuff that she may have on her mind. But for more information about this, you can visit our website. It's just onemusic.com.au. And you've got all these different tabs here, and you can see on the bottom right there, there is actually a specific landing button tab for Pilates. So you'll
Mhm.
be able to get all of the pricing, all of the information, and be able to lodge a query or a preliminary license application with us through our website. It's all there for you. And if you wanted to run through it in more detail, you can speak to Carolyn or to me, and we can give you a heads up on what it means for you and for your business.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I guess with all of that in mind, Kimberley, let's have a quick chat about how the scenario may apply to
Yeah,
you.
I thought it might be really nice if I sort of explain if we were a studio and role play into that, because a lot of people who will be listening or re-watching might have the
Hmm.
similar questions that I'm going to ask you now.
Yeah.
And if anyone has questions as they go and they throw it into questions and through the question catalog down the bottom, we can then address it along the way. So if I've been running my studio for a few years and suddenly I've just watched our One Music conversation today,
Hmm.
and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm using music and I didn't know that I needed to do this. This is something very new to me. And now I need to navigate it to ensure that I'm following all the right protocols, and I don't get into trouble. So my studio, let's just say the studio is maybe about 200 square meters,
Hmm.
and we are a clinical based studio.
Yeah.
We are open fairly early in the morning until late in the evening, but sometimes we have middle of the day that's not too busy, which is a lot of the studios out there. So we've got quite a few different arms to our studio. So that's number one in the area
Hmm.
downstairs where we have all our equipment and we
Yep.
run our one-on-ones and what we refer to as our semi-privates.
Yep.
Then upstairs, I've got five reformers that I also might run some group classes that are on our timetable.
Yep.
And we have a little mat room as well that we take about eight people in. And in that mat class, though, because we only have about three or four of the mat classes, they're not that popular at the
Okay.
moment, but we don't tend to use music in our mat classes, but we do in our reformer classes. So that's
Yep.
kind of where I'm starting at. I'm sort of doing a very broad spectrum. That isn't
Yep.
my studio exactly, but there's a lot, I'm kind of using studios
Yeah,
out there that sort of,
for
when I'm
sure.
back speaking to people.
Yeah.
What kind of questions would you ask me to begin
Great.
with?
So the first thing that I would, so it's all very straightforward, and I think
Mm,
individually here, if we just made a few assumptions, we could easily apply licenses to each of the uses that you've indicated. Obviously,
mhm,
not to your mat classes if you do not use music, so that would be something we'd immediately
mhm,
scratch off. But what I would be very interested in, first of all, is knowing really two questions that will dictate what's going to be the
mhm.
best outcome for you. Um, First of all, how many classes would you run in the reformer studio with five reformers there? Like in terms of say if we just thought of a standard week, how many
Yeah,
would you?
let's say they might do one in the morning and one at the night.
Hmm.
Maybe let's say two in the morning and two at night. For
Okay,
Monday to Thursday, there's eight and two on Saturday. Let's go 10 classes a week.
let's go 10 classes a week, um, and then the other question I've got for you is if you were to guess sort of how many individual members or users come to the studio,
Hmm.
would you have a rough idea of how many, say,
Are you
do you
talking
have
in
a
the
subscription
studio?
model? Like, is there a membership option?
Most of the studio people that I've spoken to are more that they do a prepaid. They might do 10 classes at a time, but it's not a
Okay.
subscription as
Yeah.
such for the smaller studios. When you get to
Yeah.
the bigger ones, they might, and most of the questions I've been receiving before our little build up here has been very much the smaller studio
Yeah.
scenario.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about how many people, are you talking in the studio where they do the one-on-ones and the semi-privates?
Well, just in general, like if we considered number of people individually who are
Hmm.
accessing the business,
Yep.
um, might it be,
About a
at any
hundred, let's
point in time your book of clients might be a
let's say,
hundred or
yeah, I was about to say, why don't we go about 100 a week?
all right. If we use 100 as the metric, all right.
Hmm.
So this is a really great example, by the way, Kim, because um, it's one of the examples where so many of the things you've said make a really interesting difference to us. So, first of all, the important one is at 10 classes a week, we'd probably be assessing you, give or take, like we wouldn't do a 52 weeks, but we might say let's kick off with 500 classes a year, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's about 50 weeks, 10 classes a week, 500 a year. Now, one of the important things here is that you've stated that you've only got 5 reformers. So that qualifies you for a lower class rate, right?
Hmm.
Which probably sits at about the $3.60 mark per class. So
Hmm.
straight off the bat, you're looking at about $1,800 in fees for classes, right?
Hmm.
And in addition to that, we would issue you a background music license for downstairs,
Hmm.
which based on 200 square meters and using, for example, Spotify, um, you'd be looking at potentially a fee of about $600 or $700. So if we sort of split the two separately, um, you might be looking at in total, let's say, annual fees of about $2,500 for those activities. So both the downstairs and all of its activities, as well as the upstairs reformer studio. The way that this operates is that the background music license includes provision for all of those semi-private one-on-one classes that
Hmm.
you're running. It's a really well considered license and has a lot of like benefits to it. Um, the 200 square meters is probably something we'd talk to you about because you might not be playing music across all 200 square meters. So we
Hmm.
might dumb that down and say, well, actually, if you consider reception and a couple of
Hmm.
rooms, it might be a little less. So that's a reason for the fee to be a little lower. But the
Hmm.
lion's share of the fees here are going to be in those classes. And
Hmm.
running 500 classes a year at whatever fee it costs per class, $3 odd, that's immediately going to take your
Hmm.
fees up to that point. Now, the reason that this is very, very interesting and is that if you were not a business running, um, sorry, if you had more reformers, so if you tipped over and you had more than 10 reformers or 10 mats in a studio that uses music, you would no longer qualify for the cheaper class rate. The
Hmm.
per class rate would essentially double to about $6.60. And then you'd start nudging a very similar price point to what we could offer you as far as a all-inclusive capped license
Hmm.
would look like, right?
That was my next question was
Yeah.
the number, like, so it's 10 or above
Hmm.
reformers that then you tip over that scale. Is that
Correct.
correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Hmm.
Yeah. So at that point, we would start looking at how many classes you're putting on. They're all more than 10 people. That quickly adds up in terms of fees.
Hmm.
And in most cases, the studios that have rooms that are larger than 10 reformers will probably be doing more than 10 classes a week in a lot of cases.
Hmm. Hmm.
So the fee can very quickly escalate. And
Yeah.
that's precisely why we have the
The all
all-inclusive option
inclusive.
up our sleeve. So
Yeah.
really, any of these scenarios, what's really interesting here is that you kind of, in one example, you've given us the three possible tiers of fees. You've got
Hmm.
$600 or $700 for background music, should you only run that clinical type of
Hmm.
scenario. You've got that comes up to maybe 2,000 odd dollars if you were to run a small studio, small classes as well, right?
Hmm.
And then that the end point is about 4 grand if you were a very active, large class-based
Mm.
business. So
Yeah.
that's really your tiers of licensing. And with
Yeah.
your example, you've given us kind of all of that encompassed into one. So obviously, in your case, it's not the $4,000 option. It's not the all-inclusive because you're well below that, so it'd be fine.
Mm.
But if, for example, you started running those mat classes with music and that got popular and things kind of escalated a little as far as your output, then
Mm.
that might be an example where you might hit a limit and decide you're better off with the all-inclusive license. And once you've got an all-inclusive license, it's really cool because you can then advertise and run however many classes you want. You can do 10 sessions,
Mm.
a week, a day if you want. You can do all sorts of activities in your main space downstairs as well. So the all-inclusive license, it really is as good as it
Oh,
gets in
yeah.
terms of
And
inclusions. Yeah.
and how do you know? So, how do you know whether people are doing how is it monitored by
Oh,
OneMusic?
that's a great question. And I think there are a couple of ways we do. Obviously, we're very actively scouring online and checking out businesses. We also deal directly with so many hundreds and thousands of businesses. Like, I think we've got something like 7 or 8 thousand fitness businesses on the books.
Hmm.
So we've got a pretty good understanding of kind of what's normal, what's popular.
Yeah.
So we've got a bit of a finger on the pulse with that. But generally speaking, um, it'll come down to us checking you out online. It'll come to down to conversations we have directly with you, to obviously, which is the preferred way to do it.
Mm.
And finally, if it's absolutely necessary, and in some cases we do have to resort to something that's sometimes spoken about, which is that we do have field officers and we
Hmm.
have people out in the marketplace that
Yeah.
provide us with intel.
Hmm.
Um, but that's usually something that is a last resort. So I guess this is a great segue to what happens if you don't take out a license.
Yeah.
And the way that that works is that if you are found to be using protected music without a license, ultimately that's an infringement of copyright. And that's something that's then handled through a legal avenue.
Hmm.
Um, the way that that often works is that you will always be asked on multiple occasions to take out the correct license. And then once it gets to legal, that will also be the question. So there's no really not any sort of punishment as such in terms of
Hmm.
fines or anything like that. But once time has elapsed and you're with, say, a legal process with us, there would have been a lot of time there that a license would have been required. There's often back fees associated with that, and then there may potentially be some legal fees associated with it. So what could have been handled fairly simply through, say, monthly payments, direct debits, and nice,
Hmm.
simple process kind of becomes a larger issue than it should be by tacking on fees that are for a past period, plus any penalties and whatnot that come with the legal side of it. So we find that it's never a good place to end up if it goes to legal. And something to point out is ultimately all we're doing is working with the provisions of the Copyright Act. So unlike what people might think, there's really no grey area here. You're either a music user as far as protected music
Hmm.
goes, or you're not. There's
Well,
no fence here to sit on.
something you've just said then, Jose, I think is really important to clarify because there's a lot of chatter out there that people get issued really very large fines immediately that puts them out of business. And I think this conversation here will put people at ease about that and calling you and having these discussions
Mm.
early and not sort of creating Mount Vesuvius about it. And I would like to also add here, we had a very large flood at some here in Lismore, and our studio went under.
Mm.
And it actually might have even been Carolyn that chatted to me at the time and paused everything. We're
Of
very,
course.
very accommodating
Mm.
and actually even gave me some reprieve time to get back on track. And it's not like there was this out to get you sensation about it. But I feel at the moment there is that nervousness behind the conversations about even calling.
There
And
is. And,
I
and
think
I
that's
think that's just,
important.
and it comes down to the fact that ultimately we're in the business of contacting people for something that is a also it is a legal requirement, but I think the way that it comes across is, we're putting fees in front of people and asking them to pay for something, and not everybody is either informed as to why or necessarily thrilled in some cases. Although a lot of people that we deal with are completely understanding and they do support the music industry and they understand that what we do is a really pivotal part of that machine. So we do have a lot of fantastic dealings with people, but I think some of those rumors get around when somebody maybe feels like, hey, I didn't want these guys to come and deal with me, so I'm going to complain about it and say that wasn't cool. And that certainly happens. And I think it happens with any regulatory type of organization that may be trying to tell people, hey, you're not doing the right thing. And I think people sometimes get a little shocked by hearing that, and they retreat, and maybe rather than sort of lean into it and go, hey, tell me about it, they go, hang on a second, I do everything correctly. I shouldn't be told this, and we get into a bit of an adversarial situation. And I think once that's kicked off, it's very difficult to kind of bridge that gap. But we have certainly had lots of situations where people have understood and come around and gone, yeah, I get it now. I
What
guess,
happens sorry,
yeah.
what happens if I can't afford let's just say it's the $4,000 one. Is there
Mhm.
a payment plan?
Yeah, so everything is billed monthly now. So everyone's pretty much on a payment plan from day
Yeah.
one.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, if anyone's going through financial hardship, we've got a credit team that can deal with some of those needs directly. But I think it's also important to note that if you are a business that maybe is struggling to pay some of these licenses, I know this is easier said than done, but ultimately, maybe using the full rights music isn't the best idea. Maybe exploring some of the other options might be
Yeah.
something that's on the table, because you're not obliged to use copyright music. You do have options in terms of lower fees or no fees.
Mm-hmm.
And if your business is at a point where maybe some of that stuff is getting harder to manage, perhaps it's a good opportunity to look into some of those alternatives.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And you can use no music, and you can still be a Pilates
yeah,
studio without any
yeah,
music as well.
yep,
And
yep.
when you use Spotify, is there also then, should you be paying Spotify your normal Spotify, or is there another element to Spotify or any of those Apple Music, etc.? Do you need to be paying them extra as well?
So it actually came up in one of the Q&A comments. So
Uh-huh.
Apple Music don't have a commercial version.
Mm-hmm.
Spotify do have a commercial version, which is called Soundtrack Your Brand, and
Mm-hmm.
that is always preferred to
Mm-hmm.
use. However, despite common misconceptions, it's not illegal to use services like Spotify, but you do need to cover what they are writing into their terms of use, which is to say, hey, Spotify says to the user, we don't really intend for you to use this in a business. So that's where we come in with that digital license and say, but you are using it, so we need to make sure that we have a way to cover that here in Australia. So
Okay. So if they're using Spotify and they are with OneMusic, then you're fine.
yeah, we've got ways to cover that, and we've been authorized to issue what we call like a top-up license to authorize it. Um,
Okay.
but it's always preferred if people use a commercial service, um, just because it'll be easier and it'll be a lot more
Mm-hmm.
just well set up for their business. But
Mm-hmm.
that's ultimately down to individual preference for a business. So,
Mm. Yeah. And because
um,
a lot of studios also have a lot of instructors that come in with their own playlists
yes,
on all. So it's not like there's just one.
yeah.
Uh, yeah.
The instructor question, I know that that's something we haven't touched on, but I think it is important for people to understand that if they run a business that is operating day in, day out as a specific type of business, and they bring in a contractor, whether it's an instructor or someone else, the business is ultimately still liable for what occurs under that roof.
Yeah.
Um, the only scenarios where we deal, say, directly with an instructor is if the instructor is using a public space like a hall or a rec center
Mm-hmm.
or something like that doesn't really operate in that way usually.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or, we may speak to a business individually who says, hey, look, I'm just a clinical Pilates space. I've rented a room out to a third party instructor, And in those instances, we are known to sometimes work with the studio and the instructor to make sure that everybody understands that there's a license there that the instructor holds. But
Mhm.
if the instructor were to refuse that license, we would still probably knock on the door of the studio to say, hey,
Mhm.
you're allowing this to happen. So
Yeah.
from a legal standpoint, that's something that you need to think about.
Yeah, I think too, what was also sort of insinuating there was that sometimes you can have all of your full-time and part-time and casual workers, but
Hmm.
they have their own playlists on their phones that then
Oh
connect
yeah,
to, so that's why it would be tricky to manage. Some of them
yes,
might use Apple Music, some of them might use Spotify, some of them might use other
yeah.
elements, and
And that's where the digital license actually is
yeah,
really good for.
yeah.
If you've got an all-inclusive license, you're covered for that anyway. But if
Hmm.
you're say a clinical studio or a smaller studio like yours, having that digital license kind of
Yeah,
is the way to do it, and then you
great.
don't have to worry about people using
Okay.
those services. Yeah.
That's
Um,
made it a lot clearer.
I'm just going to quickly round out. I'm mindful of time, so I appreciate everyone holding
Yeah.
on as long as you have. But just quickly, something that's obviously important is just where the money goes, and this is just
Yeah.
some parting thoughts for you to take with you. So currently, APRA has 130,000 Australian songwriter members, but we actually represent millions of rights holders around the world. So another common misconception is that we only represent Australian music, and we actually represent the music from around the world. And that's because we're members of an organization based in France called CSAC, who actually represent 227 societies across 111 countries and have 5 million songwriters registered. So through that, we're able to actually collect money on behalf of all songwriters. And then we have a system in place globally where that money moves across the world. So should Australian music be played in one of the affiliated countries, then that comes back to us as well. So it's a really great system and it's been in place for a very, very long time. Currently, APRA, AMCOS, and OneMusic distribute about 87 cents in the dollar. So it's a very high level of distribution that's courtesy of a lot of technology. Our management costs obviously vary year in, year out, but we have very high standards for how much is redistributed in terms of sending that money back to artists. And we've got really, really, really sophisticated systems now that allow us to send the money back. For any of you operating a business, we've got a little device which helps us with that. It's called Ordo, and it's like a little thing that you plug into the wall, and it's kind of like a real-time Shazam machine. So it kind of just picks up the identity of that song every time it's played, and it provides that data back to us. It's not like listening or anything; it's just picking up the metadata of the song. But that's something that people have been putting their hands up for because it allows us to know where to send this money as well. So ultimately, like I said, the money goes back to rights owners, songwriters, and publishers. And to dumb this down to really just one term, that's the business we're in. We're in the music royalties business. I think a lot of people know what a music royalty is. They don't necessarily join the dots and realize that OneMusic is the organization that's actually collecting those royalties. But really, that's our business, and that's why we do what we do. We're collecting the money that goes back to musicians and allowing them to keep doing what they do. So
Great.
thank you very, very much to everyone. That email address, fitness@onemusic.com.au. If you have any questions, comments, want to talk to one of us, want to set up a phone call with you, please just shoot us an email there at fitness@onemusic, and we'd be happy to get in touch.
Thank you very much for your time, Jose, and everybody that joined us. We really appreciate you tuning in to find out the facts about OneMusic and why it happens and what you need to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Kimberley. All the best,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thanks.